We're here with Michael Brooks of The Michael Brooks Show, and we're having a great conversation about Bolivia. Now we're gonna move on to something that you actually shared with me, Michael, that I think is so relevant today. It's a piece that was written by Mark Fisher. It's titled "Exiting the Vampire Castle," and I believe it was written in 2014.
2014 or 2015.
Yeah,
like
it was
right
written
in
a
that
little while
ballpark.
ago.
Yeah.
But it's very relevant today because it has to do with creating a political movement that really appeals and is welcoming to a broader group of people. And in order to do that, you need to kind of have a common goal and you need to keep your eye on the prize and not necessarily completely dismiss some of the differences you have with various groups of people, but understand that there are certain things that really do unite you, right? You need to move forward with them. So I wanna just read a few excerpts from the piece. So Fisher writes, "We need to learn or relearn how to build a comradeship with solidarity instead of doing capital's work for it by condemning and abusing each other. This doesn't mean, of course, that we must always agree. On the contrary, we must create conditions where disagreement can take place without fear of exclusion and excommunication." And then he writes, "The goal is not to be an activist, but to aid the working class to activate and transform itself." So let's talk a little bit about what this all means, because there is this like very hyper aware, some people refer to it as so-called woke culture that does a lot more damage in society than actually helping to create a mass movement that leads to something that would be beneficial for everyone, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think what's really interesting about the essay, I mean, one, just tragically, Mark Fisher took his own life. And I think that his own emotional reality was impacted by this stuff. And he was also writing the essay from that place. And I was actually recently honored to have a friend of his and a collaborator of his write a note to me saying like Mark would appreciate how I was talking about his work. And so I think there's a couple of different parts to it. One is their element where he's diagnosing that when you do this vampire castle stuff, especially in the context of social media, you're actually enacting capital itself, right? Because what you're really doing is you're branding yourself and you're competing for scarce resources by positioning yourself in a certain way. And that's antithetical to like the actual work of how you build commonality and brands and bonds in a mass way to achieve universal results. The other two things that I think are really important, I mean, one is that sometimes people confuse, like there is a trash version that some people bring forward, which is like, okay, so we're gonna build a mass movement, so we're gonna like leave behind like trans people or something like that. That's absolutely 1000% not what he's saying. It has nothing to do with commitments on rights and equity. It has to do with an emotional political culture. And that kind of leads to the third part, which is really like, don't you want to create like an emotionally intelligent, and I say that term like unapologetically, both because it appeals to a broader set of people because they like how you seem, and then you can actually create a coherent culture inside yourself. And just really quick, I mean, where you really start to see, again, some like the contradictions is like, some people can articulate like a utopian goal, like we're gonna live in a world with no prisons, which I think is awesome. Like, let's hold that. Let's hold that as some type of imaginative far out possibility, right? Because at the very least, we could certainly radically reduce those who are in prison 100%, right? But then on the other hand, we're gonna have a social scene where there's no sense of redemption, evolution, or change. Whether something was actually like a real mistake that somebody can grow from, which is really important, or whether it's actually just something petty and just like a social convention you're enforcing on other people. And that's the last point I'll say real quick, because I think it's also the confusing of the actual commitment on the merits and the substance with different ways of like having manners, which most people, that is where it just becomes like class and cultural differences, and you're not gonna build a mass movement, like I can convince my mother on, my mother's super on point, like my grandmother on, trans rights. I can't convince her on like, a certain like listening to certain podcasts, you know what I mean? Like that kind of distinction.
Yeah, so the way that I read this is there's been so much focus on social justice, but it's been a disingenuous focus on social justice by so many of our politicians, right?
Totally.
So we have this corrupt political system where politicians are certainly influenced by relationships that they have with those with the capital, those with the power, and they want to appease those individuals. And so rather than talk about, let's say, the rigged economic system that really does make people fight one another for those scarce resources, they focus on our social differences.
Absolutely.
And demonizing individuals who aren't saying the exact right things at the exact right time. Now, they don't offer much when it comes to policy and protecting disenfranchised groups of people, but they make, these declarative statements about how they care about certain disenfranchised groups of people. And I think that makes the electorate hyper aware of those social issues. It's fascinating because you're right in that we get distracted by the things that we dislike about our peers, as opposed to focusing on the things that we need to fight for together.
Absolutely, and then it becomes like the contradiction between, like, say you're building a progressive project or a socialist project, but we're all doing it on these social platforms that incentivize the exact opposite of the behavior. And that's another thing that some people miss about how deep the argument is. They think it's like some type of just sort of like hipster, sophisticated version of like, let's be civil. It's not that, it's much deeper. It's saying when you do this, you're replicating the enemy's terrain and you cannot win on their terrain. That's something like literally you read like any guerrilla fighting manual, and it feels ridiculous to compare that to like being on Twitter, but it's the same dynamic. You have to come up with something radically new, and that actually does involve like not discarding other human beings, and actually conversely then the actual honesty within ourselves and each other to really actually like become woke, because then you can actually acknowledge your mistakes.
Yeah.
You can actually evolve, you can actually argue about things, and then you can really create that commonality to win.
Oh, you want to see more videos like this. Just subscribe to the channel below. And don't forget to become a TYT member and download the TYT Plus app on your phone. Head over to tyt.com/join today.